Welcome, everybody. My name is Harvey Reiter. I'm a member of the board of the JCRC, and I know a number of you have attended some of these virtual brown bag lunches before. Some of you even attended when we were doing this in person, and hopefully we can do that again sometime in the not too distant future. The virtual brown bag program is sponsored by the JCRC of Greater Washington, the American Association of Jewish Lawyers and Jurists, SEDIC, DC, and the Federation of Greater Washington. And we've done a number of series of programs, not every month, but most months. And we have a very important topic today to discuss the impact of climate change and what we can do about it. I want to thank in advance the people who are here attending today, as well as our speakers and our moderator. And I'll return to that in just a moment. But I do want to mention a couple of things at the outset. The JCRC acts through its resolutions to decide what legislation to support, what actions it should take as an organization. And one of those resolutions is a resolution on climate change that we adopted in October of 2020. It's available on the JCRC website, www.jcouncil.org, and you can find it there along with a lot of the other resolutions that define the policies that govern the positions that the organization takes. I mention that in part because there are upcoming meetings in both Annapolis and in Richmond where the JCRC will be represented. We follow the legislation in both states pretty closely. And so we're looking, for example, consistent with our policy position on climate change, at a number of bills in Annapolis. There's a bill by State Senator Pinsky and another similar bill by Delegate Kumar in the House of Delegates in Maryland. Those bills are still incomplete, and there's some other climate change related bills that will be coming before the legislature, and we'll be looking at those consistent with the provisions in the resolution. Similarly, there's a bill in Richmond currently, SB 565 by Senator Surville, to encourage substitution of biogas for natural gas. And there's probably some other, as well as to improve the energy efficiency. So those are types of things that the JCRC will be looking at. I did also want to put in a plug for kind of a virtual parlor meeting that people are free to attend, and I hope you'll sign up for. Tomorrow night, there'll be meetings with the delegates and the state senator from districts 14 and 15 in Maryland. And you can sign up to attend those and meet virtually with your legislators to talk about the issues on the JCRC's agenda. So I guess I want to turn now to the topic of the day, and we're going to hear a lot more from our speakers and our moderator about it. But I wanted to focus on some of the impact. The resolution that JCRC adopted focused on some of the inevitable impacts of climate change and the desire for the organization to speak out about what people can do about it. Anybody who's read the newspaper or watched TV over the last year has seen some of the dramatic extreme climate events, extreme weather events over the last year. No one single event constitutes a trend, but they're pretty startling all put together, and they reinforce what the UN panel on climate change concluded about 6 or 7 months ago. That is that we are past the tipping point, and that all we can do is keep things from getting worse. So just to think about this, I mean, you may have remembered some of these individually, but it's pretty dramatic. You think back to last June. In last June, the highest temperature north of the Arctic Circle was recorded, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That same month, The temperature in Lytton, British Columbia, it's a small town north of Vancouver, reached 121 degrees. That was hotter than the highest temperature ever recorded in Las Vegas. August was quite a month for weather events. The temperature in Sicily reached 120 degrees. That's the highest temperature ever recorded in Europe. That same month, rain fell on the highest plateau on the Greenland ice sheet. It rained there for the first time ever. That same month in Tennessee, 17 inches of rain fell in a single day, causing massive inland flooding. And later that month, August was quite the month. We all probably remember Hurricane Ida. And Hurricane Ida started in Venezuela, and it didn't end until it became a tropical storm, still causing damage in early October in Nova Scotia. And in between, it killed over 100 people. Some people flooded out of their basements, even here in Rockville, Maryland. Then in September, the highest temperature ever recorded that late in the year was recorded in Death Valley in California. And in December, we had more dramatic weather events. There were a string of very deadly tornadoes that struck Kentucky and 7 other states. And then again in December, the Arctic Global Report card declared that Arctic temperatures had risen again to a new record, rising twice as fast as the global average. We had the first ever tornado recorded in Minnesota during the month of December. And then, of course, we had the wildfires in Colorado that month as well. Now, I say all of this not to alarm people, but to say that there's an urgent need for action and that we can do something about it. The JCRC's policy statement back in October 2020 presaged what the UN panel's August 21 report said. And here's what the JCRC said. It may well be too late to prevent all the adverse impacts of climate change, but it urged the Jewish community and all communities to act unequivocally to protect nature and environment from future harm and to ameliorate, to the extent possible, the harms that we can no longer prevent. Now, the purpose of stating this isn't to be alarmist, but it is to suggest that we should be hopeful that our voices and our actions can make a difference. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Swartz of JCRC to introduce our panelists, Joelle Novey and Rabbi Daniel Swartz. And I thank you again, everyone, for attending today.
Well, thank you, Harvey. And hold on one second, please. Okay. Hi, I am Rabbi Abby Sharofsky. I'm the Director of Intergroup Relations and Rabbi in Residence for the JCRC. And I'm happy to be here today, and I'd like to say more that I am honored to be able to introduce these two leaders in the move to counteract climate change, people who are actively working for environmental justice, climate justice. And in some ways, I wish we didn't have to have this conversation. Not in some ways, in all ways. I wish that we weren't doing this, because that would mean there wasn't a need to have this conversation. And yet there is. There's a need to have this conversation for all of the reasons that Harvey said. There's also a need to have this conversation not to bring, not to have a feeling of hopelessness on it. That was something in preparing for this. We realized that this is a very big conversation and it's intimidating. Where do we start? What do you do? This project, this whole endeavor of saving the environment, as it is too huge for any one person, and it's not going to be changed by just changing some light bulbs. It's a much larger piece, and frankly, to me, it feels impossible. but I know that I can't live like that. I can't have that sort of mindset going into this. And so thinking about our tradition, I also think about how we approach this topic with a sense of hope. And a lot of the different organizations in the Jewish community that are working on climate activism and climate and environmental justice point to the idea that in Judaism, we're not just doing this. We don't just take care of the environment for now, we take care of the environment for the future. And that while what's happening now seems dire, we are not doing this to make things better for ourselves in the here and now, but for those that will come after us. The story of Honi, who planted a tree, the story in the Talmud, he planted a tree and everyone, his neighbors all mocked him saying, Honi, you'll be dead and gone by the time that tree comes up. And he said, I'm not planting this for me. I'm doing this for my grandchildren. And that ethos of this work is on us now to be able to do it so that not just in our time we can start to see something, but so that our children and our children's children and the generations that are to come can have a safe and beautiful home on this planet. And I am delighted to be able to introduce two people working very hard in this area, Rabbi Daniel Swartz and Joelle Novey. Rabbi Daniel is the executive director of the Coalition on the Environment and Jewish Life and has held this position since January of 2018. He has led the congregation of Temple Chesed of Scranton, PA since 2006, and he is deeply committed to the task of Tikkun Olam, repairing our world. Rabbi Swartz has also served on a number of prominent social justice organizations, including as a founding coordinator for the Greater Washington Interfaith Power and Light. Rabbi Swartz is the author of To Till and to Tend, a guide for Jewish environmental study and action, as well as a children's book, Bim and Bam, a Shabbat Tale. Joelle Novey is the executive director of Interfaith Power and Light for DC, Maryland, and for DC, Maryland, Virginia. Joelle has served as IPLDMV's director since the fall of 2009 and speaks widely on the role that faith communities can play in the climate movement. She is the co-author of Green and Just Celebrations, a purchasing guide that Jews United for Justice distributes to local congregations for assisting families in making greener purchasing decisions around weddings and bar and bat mitzvah celebrations. And I am pleased to hand it over to Rabbi Daniel.
Thank you so much, Abby. And I, like Harvey, want to echo my thanks to everybody who is here today. I want to start with a question. So, if everybody can take a moment to close your eyes and think of the first image that comes to mind when you hear the word environment. Now, once you got that firmly in mind, open your eyes and raise your hand if there were any people in that picture. And we see very few hands up. And that is really common. I've been asking this question for more than 20 years now to hundreds of different audiences, and there's never more than a handful of hands up, never more than 5%, certainly. And that's because I think quite incorrectly, we tend to think of the environment as something that's out there, that it's whales and wilderness or parks and pandas, when really we need to understand that there's not a separation there, that the environment is our common home, whether for better or for worse, that it's where we live and work and study, and even where we pray and celebrate. And so whatever we do in the world affects the environment, and the health of the environment affects us very intimately and profoundly. And only when we see that connection are we going to be able to really take care of issues like the climate. So I was fortunate to be part of a global interfaith delegation put together by the Vatican over the past year. We started, they enlisted 40 global leaders. I must admit that I had a little bit of a feeling of the old Sesame Street song when I looked at the list. One of these things is not like the other. We had the Pope, obviously, and the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, the head of the Orthodox Church and the head of the World Council of Churches, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. We had the General Secretary of the Muslim World League, some senior Ayatollahs, the head of Muhammadiyah in Indonesia. We had heads of major Buddhist and Hindu and Sikh and Jain organizations. But part of my role, as well as that, as another resident of the Greater Washington area, Dr. Rajwant Singh, we were the nudges. Our job was, as passionate people who had really focused on environmental work for most of our life and connecting that with faith, to push these leaders who had, broad responsibilities to global organizations a little further. So we met online for most of a year, briefing each other, learning from scientists, talking together, and writing a document that was designed to help push the nations of the world at COP26, the recent climate negotiations held in Glasgow. And it was, we were to meet in person, COVID willing, and it turned out we had a great window there at the Vatican on October 4th on St. Francis Day. And very conveniently, the Pope also chose a day that was my 10th wedding anniversary. So Rabbi Marjorie Berman and I went to Tuscany first. And when we were there, we saw how beautiful it was and how beset it was by drought. It had not rained in 4 months. Everyone that we talked to there had the same reaction when we told them why I was there. First, that there were no climate deniers. Their olive orchards, their vineyards, their wheat fields were being affected by this. They knew climate change was going on. Secondly, when we mentioned the Pope, they all smiled. And third, when we talked about that this was a dialogue between different faith groups and scientists, they were all a little puzzled and hopeful at that notion. But I think they were a little reflecting on Galileo and old notions of science and religion being at odds with each other instead of this possible coordination. And they were very glad to hear that. So on October 4th, we gathered in the Hall of Blessing of the Vatican. It's a huge room covered with beautiful art. Chance for all of us to shake hands together and to speak in this hall that was the size of a football field, not of a whole football stadium, but the field itself. And we had a chance to share with the press of the world about the document that we were signing, and we had a chance for some smaller meetings, which I might talk about during question and answer, where we also talked about the idea of the importance of education for sustainability. And so we met with each other, we worked with each other in person, and we presented to the leadership of COP26 this document called Faith and Science Towards COP26. And it was read at COP26. And this is a picture of it. There were 2 main meeting rooms at COP26. And our documents serve as kind of the mezuzah. It was the gateway between one and the other. And I know it was referenced. How much of a difference it made, it's hard to evaluate those things. But we tried to articulate the values that our faiths held in common that I think can really guide us as we try to address climate change. For example, the main values that we sought were love, justice and inclusion, and hope. Let's start with the love connection here. This is a line from Genesis that seems like it's just talking about geography, but if you're a student of the Zohar, you'll understand that, at least to the mystics of our tradition, this has a much deeper sense of meaning. If you look at it as a rabbi would, looking for the koshi, for the difficulty, the odd wording, you'll see that it talks about a river coming forth from Eden. Wait, to water the garden. Isn't Eden the garden? So what's this watering of the garden from Eden? And you'll also see that it's in the present tense. And in the Zohar and other Jewish mystical works, it talks about this sentence indicating that where we live, this is the garden, wherever we are. Some gardens are more hidden than others, but it's all the garden. And that river is the constant flow of divine love that connects all of life. We can ignore it. We can push it aside. We can live focused on other things, but it is there. And if we welcome it, then we can find these deeper connections. And so we wrote in our appeal, we are deeply interdependent with each other and with the natural world. This connection is the basis for interpersonal and intergenerational solidarity and for overcoming selfishness. Damage to the environment is a result in part of the predatory tendency to see the natural world as something to be exploited with disregard for the extent to which survival hinges on biodiversity and on maintaining the health of planetary and local ecosystems. Multiple crises facing humanity are demonstrating the failures of such an approach. These are ultimately linked to a crisis of values, ethical and spiritual. Now let's turn to the idea of justice, solidarity, and inclusion. And I want to start with a few texts from history moving up toward the present. The first is a text from Leviticus Rabbah. And I know that we've all met people like this. Some people were sitting in a ship. One of them took a drill and began to bore a hole in the ship under where he was sitting. His companion said, "What are you sitting and doing?" He said, "What is it to do with you? I'm boring a hole under my part of the ship." They said, "But the water is coming in and sinking the ship under us all." You know, when we hear about resistance to masking and to social distancing, when we see people's and corporations' lack of regard for their environmental consequences of their action, we're seeing this midrash, unfortunately, in action. It also reminds us of what Emma Lazarus said with regards to the Colossus, the poem that she wrote for the Statue of Liberty and in commemoration of the immigration of Russian Jews and others. We are none of us free until all of us are free. And how that was echoed in the 60s by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." And to think about that, first a look at the past and then a look at 4 different dimensions of justice that arise when we think of climate change. Ezekiel wrote, is it not enough for you to graze on choice grazing ground, but you must also trample with your feet what is left from your grazing? And is it not enough for you to drink clear water, but you must also muddy with your feet what is left? And must my flock graze on what your feet have trampled and drink what your feet have muddied? Now, interestingly, for our present society that values wealth and success, that's not God's flock. God's flock are the people who are being oppressed, not the fat sheep, but the ones who are being cut off from environmental health and well-being. So this is an old problem, but we're seeing it now in new ways. The first dimension that I'd like to think about is between nations. And this picture is one of the starkest graphical depictions of injustice that I know. On the top half, the countries that are in darkest red are those with the highest per capita emissions. And the bottom half is the countries who are most vulnerable to climate change. And you'll see, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, they're exact opposites of each other. The people who are causing the most problems are going to suffer the least, and the people who are causing the fewest problems are suffering the most. That's a profound injustice. And so we wrote, climate change is a grave threat. In the interest of justice and fairness, we advocate for common but differentiated climate action at all levels, from individual behavioral changes to high-level political decision-making processes. The world is called to achieve net zero carbon emissions as soon as possible, with wealthier countries taking the lead in reducing their own emissions and in financing emission reductions from poorer nations. Justice here is a recognition that we're all in it together, but some of us are more to blame and some of us have more resources to help the problem, and so we need to step up more. The second dimension of injustice is within nations. Even when you're talking about a wealthier nation, there are people who suffer much more from environmental problems in that nation. So this is a picture of exposure to fine particulates in the Northeastern and Mid-Atlantic regions. And if you see a smokestack and you see soot coming out, that's really ugly, but that's not the most dangerous part of soot pollution. It's really these fine particles that get in our lungs and cause not only lung problems, but also reduce our, affect our immune system, affect cardiac system. And this is a depiction of a 60% difference in average exposure between communities of color and white communities throughout the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And just this one change in exposure means that residents of color have 1 microgram per cubic meter greater exposure to PM 2.5, and that causes a whole range of lung issues, cardiac issues, but it also leads to an 8% increase in risk for death from COVID. Just this one type of pollutant and the injustice in terms of where pollution is allowed and where it's restricted means that communities of color are facing an 8% greater risk of death from COVID. Other places where we see this, so you would think that a hurricane is kind of an equal opportunity crisis. And yet we see that even with something like Hurricane Katrina, that it was the poor and heavily African-American neighborhoods that were flooded the most and that were denied resources during the rebuilding. You know, that if there were the National Fair Housing Allowance had calls from white folks and from people of color, and there was a really high disparity in the response about housing availability, discounts, waived security deposits, and this has caused those neighborhoods to have a much slower trajectory towards healing. If we look in the greater Washington area, and these are just a few of many problems, you'll see, for example, that the largest concentration of trash transfer stations is in minority neighborhoods in the 5th Ward. And that includes mercury, medical waste, lead. The Anacostia River surrounds Wards 7 and 8. Now, since the 60s, special funding structures have been in place to clean up and restore the Potomac, which goes through the wealthier neighborhoods, but not the Anacostia. And climate modeling shows that Wards 7 and 8 are the most vulnerable to heat waves, to flooding and storms. And this is even before you factor in that they are also the places least capable of dealing with heat waves because of lack of air conditioning and adequate housing. So the environment, even within a country, affects different populations differently. And so we wrote, we will accompany nations in seeking to protect and invest in the marginalized groups and vulnerable populations within their own borders, who for too long have borne disproportionate burdens and been on the front lines of poverty, pollution, and pandemic. The rights of indigenous peoples and local communities must be given special attention, protecting them from predatory economic interests. They have been caretakers of the earth for millennia. We should listen to them and be willing to be guided by their wisdom. The third dimension of injustice has to do with solutions and mitigation. So this is a picture of Florida and of Bangladesh. And the areas in red are those that are vulnerable to flooding if there's a 30 centimeter sea level rise, which we could see within decades. The areas in tan are those that are vulnerable for a 1 to 5 meter sea level rise. And you'll see that these are both very flat areas. You know, when we think of mountains in Florida, there's Space Mountain, and that's kind of about it. So these are both really vulnerable areas. And yet, if you look at the cities in Florida that are listed, we've got Palm Beach, we've got Miami Beach, we've got Boca Raton. These are areas, of course, there is poverty there as well, but these are very wealthy areas that have the resources to build seawalls, to move residents, and so on. But these areas in Bangladesh, this is an overlay of the economic situation of those areas. And the regions that are in the darkest maroon are in the poorest 0.1% of the globe, and the other maroon is in the poorest 1% in the globe. So this is a place that does not have the resources to protect its own citizens. These are citizens who are living on the edge, in inadequate housing very often, and so the same problems will affect them greater, and they have fewer resources to solve or mitigate those problems. Our sources have actually addressed this kind of issue. Now, I know that the resonance of talking about walls nowadays, it brings up a whole different political picture. But in the medieval world, when you were talking about a city wall, it wasn't about immigration in one region and another. It was about protection from marauders. When we traveled in Tuscany, which was a highly agricultural region, all of the old cities are built on the hilltops with a wall around them. And from a practical standpoint, that makes no sense, because that means you have to schlep down to the fields every day, schlep down to where the water is every day. Why build on the top of the hillside and put a wall around you? Because all these other cities were attacking you. And so a city wall protects everybody in that city. And so how do you pay for it? The Shulchan Aruch says, when they collect taxes from the people of the city in order to build a protective wall, it is collected according to wealth, ability to pay. And only after it is divided up, they also collect from those closer to the wall, those closer paying more because they're in greater danger if the wall should fall, but those are the poorer neighborhoods. And if there is a house close to the wall that does not have money and one far from the wall that does, do not collect from the close one because it does not have anything. You know, in the language of halakha, it seems kind of obvious. You collect from those who have the money to build the wall. You don't try to collect from those who don't. But somehow that is not making its way into some climate negotiations. And so we wrote, we beg those nations with the greatest responsibility and present capacity to step up their climate action at home, fulfill existing promises to provide substantial financial support to vulnerable countries, agree on new targets to enable them to become climate resilient, as well as to adapt to and to address climate change and loss and damage, which is already a reality for many countries. The final dimension of climate change injustice is that between generations. Now, we read this beautiful passage from Deuteronomy on several occasions during the year. I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse. And we often end with that next two words, choose life. And miss that important final phrase, which is that you and your descendants might live. But we don't think that way politically. When the Office of Management and Budget evaluates the costs and benefits of a given law or regulation, it places a discount on the future. And that makes sense in some circumstances. Most of us would rather get $1 today than in a week. But when you're thinking long-term for climate, what that does is that disadvantages future generations at a huge level. Under previous administrations, that discount rate was 7%. It's currently set at 3.4%. If you're talking about 7%, all you have to do is go out 10 years for the future to be on sale at 50% off. It means our kids every 10 years are worth half as much according to this calculation. And I know of some parents who sometimes on a given day, your child might be worth less to you than they were the day before. But for any of us to think that they are worth half as much every 10 years, that's just not the way that a parent acts. That's not the way that a responsible society acts. And so we wrote, humanity has the power to think and the freedom to choose. We must address these challenges using the knowledge of science and the wisdom of religion, to know more and to care more. We should seek solutions within ourselves, with our communities, and with nature, adopting an integral approach. We must think long-term for the sake of the whole of humanity now and in the future. I want to wrap up with a couple of principles, one about precaution and one about hope. Now, we read in the secular writings about this idea of a precautionary principle. Well, before that existed, there was what I would call the parapet principle. Now, a parapet, of course, is not two cute dogs, but is instead that little wall around the roof. We don't have it so much here in Scranton, PA, where I live, or even in DC, because there's lots of rain and there's snow and there's cold and we don't hang out on our roofs. But throughout the Middle East, people are on the roof because it's cooler at certain parts of the day, because you can grow things, because you can dry your clothes, because that's where you sunbathe. That's where David saw Bathsheba. And so in Deuteronomy, we read that rather than trying to pick up the pieces after somebody falls off, you build a parapet to keep them from falling off in the first place. I mean, Maimonides said that there is no difference between a roof and anything else that is dangerous. It is a positive mitzvah to remove any stumbling block that is a danger to life as a precaution. The sages have prohibited many things because they involve a threat to life. A person who disregards them and says, "What claim have others on me if I risk my own life?" or "I don't have to be careful," should be lashed for disobedience. And we wrote it in our appeal, the warnings from the scientific community are becoming increasingly stark and clear, as is the need for concrete steps to be taken. Scientists say that the time is running out. Now, I'm not advocating lashing anybody, but we really need to see that there is this problem, and we need to see that those who are not taking care of their own life, that is costing society as a whole. We closed our appeal with words on hope. And this I was especially a nudge about, because I really think that when you think about climate change, that the natural reaction is to curl into a little fetal ball or to bury your head in the sand, as Charlie Brown used to do. And if we're ever going to come out of that, we need to think about hope. And if there is anything that faith traditions have given as a resource to humanity over the past few thousand years, I think hope is possibly our most precious gift. Even in the book of Job, which is not necessarily so hopeful as a whole, there's this great sentence. There is hope for a tree. If it is cut down, it will renew itself. Its shoots will not cease. If its roots are old in the earth and its stump dies in the ground, at the scent of water, it will bud and produce branches like a sapling. Now, when we were drafting this appeal, it went through various drafts. And because there were so few people from America, there were 4 Americans on that panel of 40. And because so few of them were people who are part of the large community of faith activists working on the environment, I made it part of my duty to share the various drafts with different people, including a number of folks who are on this brown bag right now, and take the comments, the wise additions that they had, and try to integrate them into the document. And this was one of the paragraphs that we came up with that was added to the document. We are currently at a moment of opportunity and truth. We pray that our human family may unite to save our common home before it is too late. Future generations will never forgive us if we squander this precious opportunity. We have inherited a garden. We must not leave a desert to our children. Scientists have warned us that there might be only 1 decade left to restore the planet. We plead with the international community gathered at COP26 to take speedy, responsible, and shared action to safeguard, restore, and heal our wounded humanity and the home entrusted to our stewardship. We appeal to everyone on this planet to join us on this common journey, knowing well that what we can achieve depends not only on opportunities and resources, but also on hope, courage, solidarity, and goodwill. In an age fraught with division and despair, we look with hope and unity to the future. We seek to serve the people of the world, particularly the poor and the future generations, by encouraging a prophetic vision, a creative, respectful, and courageous action for the sake of the earth, our common home. And that's how we closed the appeal, trying to not be those who would condemn the world to greater fire, but be among those who plant trees, as Abby spoke about at the beginning. So what do we do about it? I'm going to hand most of that off to Joelle, who will also be talking about some things specific to this region. But let me give 3 quick points before doing that. When I'm asked what's the one thing you would do, I'm a rabbi, so I don't say one thing. I say 3 things. And the first thing that I say is that the most important climate action you can take is to love your neighbor more and to expand your definition of neighbor. You know, King wrote about in the idea of the beloved community, and we have many sources within the Jewish tradition about calling all of humanity our neighbors. And that's great. That would be a big improvement for most people. But I really think that our neighbors are all of life. And we need to love that more. And the more that we love, the more that we care, the more we'll be motivated to take the actions we need to take. So what are some of those concrete actions? Well, look at what you're doing and add one thing. It almost doesn't matter which thing, because as important as those are, light bulbs, volunteering, driving less, flying less, donating more, our individual actions, we're not going to solve climate change one light bulb at a time, or even if lots and lots of people change light bulbs. But when you take that one action, it gets you out of the fetal position. It gives you a sense of agency. It starts you talking with friends. It gets you involved, and then it can lead to the next step, which is to get involved politically. We need to work together as society, as a nation, as a globe, to change laws and policies to bring us into a safe climate future. And that's not going to happen if we stand on the sidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I am Joelle Novey, she, her, with Interfaith Power and Light. I work with congregations of all faith traditions all over the region, but it's a particular pleasure and honor to get to hang out with Jewish organizations and talk with Jewish folks about this work, my own people. And it means a lot to have the JCRC raising up this issue. I want to say thank you to JCRC as well. Rabbi David was who encyclical on ecology, Laudato Si, to a call to action to all people on earth, not just Catholics. And now it sounds like this interfaith gathering at the Vatican amplified that call to all people, to all of us. And the question is, well, what are we going to do about this? How do we respond? Rabbi Abby started by saying, I kind of wish we didn't have to have this conversation. And I totally know what she means. It is such a drag when you really think about, and we saw that list that Harvey made at the beginning of the impacts of climate change. And it is really, I just felt like my heart rate kept going up and up and up, right? So it is really hard to think about and reckon with the reality that our burning fossil fuels for electricity has been pouring this heat trapping climate pollution into our atmosphere, causing our earth to warm more rapidly and more and more rapidly as time goes on, that we are the first generation to be experiencing those impacts, and the last generation that's going to be able to do anything about it. I totally relate to Abby's impulse to just wish we didn't have to think about it. And the fact is, I could shut this out probably. Like those of us who are right now, like I could decide, like, I'm just not going to care about people who are in other countries or people who are less than I am, to be able to rebound if there's flooding or strong storms. I I could say, okay, I'm just not going to worry about people who are alive on Earth after I'm gone, because, you know, this generation's not going to see the worst of it. I could say, okay, I'm going to shut out impacts on other species, anyone not human, and just focus on what I as a human being can do to protect myself from these consequences. But then I think about what I'd be losing if I made my world that small, right? So I was raised in a Jewish community that affirmed the infinite value of every human life and said that whoever saves a single life saves the whole world. So how could I possibly just say, well, people who are less privileged, people who don't have resources, I don't care what happens to their homes or their livelihoods. I have kids, and I was raised in Jewish communities that cherished children and said that the whole world endures for the sake of the breath of school children. And how could I possibly just say, well, you know, I've received this tradition over 2,000 years, but I'm not going to worry about whether that continuity is possible in the future to the people, to our descendants, and just give up on the world that my children might live in being habitable for them. I have to let go of the Jewish teachings I received about the sanctity of life. Have their appointed role in creation. You might not know what it is, but it's not yours to just decide that we can write off certain species. So I keep coming back over and over again to the feeling that I could make my world small enough not to have to care about this, and you can too, but we would be losing more than we gain. We would be so lonely and so cut off from everything that we've been taught is important and sacred, and everything that gives life meaning, and everything that connects us to each other. And so I want to, thank you for coming today and having this conversation and caring and hearing about our reality, because I actually think the way forward, even when it's heartbreaking, is to reckon with this reality and to be together in responding. I love the image Rabbi Daniel shared about being fed by the river, right? Being fed by the waters, and I love that in the Psalms it says you're planted by the idea of a tree planted by the water that is continually fed, and wherever you are in every moment, there's still something new. And I think about that as like we are planted in this moment in history where we're in this critical moment with the climate crisis. It's unprecedented. No one could have imagined, none of our ancestors could have imagined this moment where human beings are driving the climate, but we are still fed, even here, by our tradition, and we can get sustenance and direction from our own, from Jewish tradition. We can still be fed in this moment, even in this weird moment that we're all in together. So what does it look like when Jewish communities in the DC metro area, working together with Interfaith Power and Light, respond to the climate crisis? What can that look like for you and your communities? And the first is to do what you're doing today, which is to listen and talk about it. It is so hard to talk about what's happening to our world. This is the first part of our website. Our website is in 3 sections: learn, go green, and speak out. So learn is the first one. We can talk to each other about what's happening to our world, not just learn about the terrible things that the climate crisis is bringing, but also think about how it makes us feel and share with each other. Why does climate change matter to you? There's some conversation you can have that no one else can have. There are people in your life who I can't talk to about climate change, but you can because you know them and they care what you think. So I encourage you to have these conversations, and I thank you for being open to this conversation today. I never know when we're talking about climate change, no matter how many people signed up for the Zoom. I never take for granted that they're all going to show up, because I think a lot of us think, oh, I don't really want to talk about climate change right now. It's hard to talk about. So thank you for being here and being open. And I invite you to think about you. Remember that none of us need to be anybody different about need to be climate change, because I guarantee you, the climate crisis is endangering the things you love, the things you care about. You can't live out your values in the world without taking action on you. And anyone else you talk about, they are also the person they need to be to respond, because they're also are not consistent with warming, rapidly warming, and things they love and care about, they too want to protect by taking action on climate. We are, am I okay for the moment? Okay, great. Interfaith Power and Light is happy to help bring these conversations to your community, find speakers, and support education about climate change. So that we talked about learn. Go green. So we can support, it's very important, our congregations are beacons in our communities, and there are so many ways to live out our vision of how the world needs to be in our congregations. And in our building up a green team, putting events on the ground, you're more resilient, and so that you can welcome wildlife and other species onto your grounds. We can support your congregation in shifting to solar energy. We can also talk about things people can do at home that you can do as a community. Adat Shalom Reconstructionist congregation got 80 people or something like that to subscribe to a community solar site. They subscribed at home to community solar, and then they all went on a field trip to visit their solar panels. Lots of beautiful ways that we can live out our concern and our values in our communities and in our life together. And we're happy to support any green initiatives that that you want to take on and to share what other folks are doing. But part of why I'm so glad this is the JCRC meeting is that at the end of the day, we cannot address climate change individually or communally. It is a global challenge, and it is a global challenge caused first and foremost by corporate polluters who have not been held accountable and have not had any limits placed on them. And we're only going to meet a global challenge by forming a movement large enough to pass laws. And that's why the JCRC is exactly the right kind of organization that leads people to act on their values by advocating for legislation that reflects our Jewish values, is exactly the right place to be talking about addressing climate change. So I want to just describe some of the ways that folks in the Interfaith Power and Light Network, in all of our jurisdictions locally, are taking action right now legislatively, and I'll try to do it in 6 minutes. Let's see, let's start in Maryland. So in Maryland, we have two pieces of legislation that we're focused on the most right now. One is a kind of comprehensive climate package recently introduced in the Senate as Climate Solutions Now. I'm going to try to talk and put things in the chat that you can look at. Let me do both. And we're particularly focused, this is a comprehensive climate bill, but we're particularly focused on the buildings piece. We are talking more and more in all of our jurisdictions about the fact that burning gas is really not consistent with our climate goals, that we really need to think about a world beyond combustion where we don't burn anything, including methane gas, to get what we need. And so we're trying to stop making things worse by asking that new buildings, like new construction in Maryland, not have any gas hookups, that we just go all electric moving forward, and then we put very strong energy targets on the existing largest buildings. So that's just two pieces of a very big climate package that I invite you to learn more about in that fact sheet. Another really fun thing in Maryland, very meaningful thing in Maryland, is that Rabbi Nina Beth Cardin has been leading for a number of years, and it might really happen this year, a campaign to amend Maryland's constitution to codify our right to a healthful environment. So you might think you already have a right to a healthful environment, but in fact, it's not actually an enforceable part of Maryland's constitution, and we're going to try to vote to put it on the ballot to amend Maryland's constitution so that we have an actual codified right to a healthful environment and can hold polluters accountable when they violate that right. In DC, community groups, including my own Tifereth Israel congregation for Tu B'Shvat, have been getting groups of people of different ages to walk around with a gas leak detector appliance and actually measure gas leaks in our communities, and are finding that there are a lot more gas leaks than Washington Gas or the DC Council seem to know about. And it's really pretty alarming, even though it's been a fun activity to document. On the 23rd of February, we're going to have release a report talking about how many dangerous and serious gas leaks there are all over the district, and really inviting everyone to think about what would it look like to just say gas leaks. If there's gas in the pipes, it's going to leak, and we need to move to an all-electric future. Happy to talk more about that. I don't have a link for you, but I'm happy to talk more with anyone who's interested in really, we're calling it turning away from burning. We all need to be turning away from burning. Imagine a world beyond combustion and beyond even gas as one of our fuel sources. And finally, in Virginia, we follow the lead of our sister. I was incorrectly introduced as the IPL director for Virginia. I'm actually IPL DMV serves only Northern Virginia, and our legislative work in Virginia is really led by our sister IPL, Virginia Interfaith Power and Light. I linked to their legislative priorities. They have a number of things they're working on, all of which really center the intersections that Rabbi Daniel talked about between human needs and our environment. So things about making sure people have access to public utilities, and that people don't get cut off from the basic services when they have difficulties. Water access and infrastructure, energy burden, they how much of low-income folks' income is spent on energy, and other environmental justice there was an environmental justice commission, making sure some of those big picture things stay in place in the new administration. More details in that link. And finally, since I see the amazing Dalia Rakowitz, the Washington director of Dayenu, on this call, but I was going to say this anyway, it's very important to remember we still have extremely groundbreaking climate legislation before the US Senate that passed the House in the Build Back Better Act. And it's, we still have an incredibly important opportunity to just keep, even our Maryland senators who are big champs, and our, Virginia senators who are pretty supportive also, like, for all of them be hearing from us all the time, like, we are not letting up. We have to pass the Build Back Better Act. It's a critical piece of federal legislation for our climate. And Dayenu has been doing an extraordinary job leading the Jewish federal advocacy charge on amplifying our call for all of the Senate to go big on climate in that piece of legislation. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to chatting with everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Joelle, Rabbi Daniel. We now would like to take some time to open this up for Q&A. Harvey, is there anything you would like to add before I put out the first question? And please feel free to use the chat, and I will go through and moderate the questions. You can also, if you're feeling like you want to, we're a decent sized group, so if you'd like to use the raise your hand feature, I can also call on you to ask your question.
Abby, as long as you ask me, maybe I'll just start with a couple of questions I had of my own to direct to Joelle and to Rabbi Swartz. The first one is whether the coalitions, that the religious coalitions that are pushing for action on climate change have included active participants from the religious right. I know some years ago they were speaking out, and are they allies who would push some of the action in red states, for example? And then my second question goes to, aside from the legislative changes that Joelle was talking about, whether the religious organizations are also looking at regulatory agencies where there are existing laws that that have flexible provisions in them that allow agencies to establish policies that can mitigate the impacts of climate change. Whether we're talking about the EPA or state environmental agencies or state energy regulatory agencies.
Daniel, can you say anything about evangelical or right-wing representation at the Vatican? And then I'll.
Yeah, so there was the head of the World Evangelical Council was there and has been involved in this. And I know, nationally, the Evangelical Environmental Network, which is also based in Pennsylvania and New York, have been doing this. To some extent, sometimes the National Evangelical Alliance has been behind this. It is not one of their major issues. And so there are clearly voices within the evangelical community. Are they the loudest, biggest voices? Not so much.
Yeah, I think that it's a sort of a basic assumption of our work that every faith community has the green sheep, right? There's somebody in every faith community who feels this deeply in their heart, that to respond, to live out their faith in this moment requires them to take action on this issue. And when we approach any congregation, we presume that those green sheep are there. We need to connect with them. There are, if you're interested, there are very important sort of organizing work internal to every faith group. There's lots of good stuff happening with the Catholic Climate Covenant and other Catholic groups. Lots of good work happening with the Evangelical Environmental Network, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. Some evangelical leaders named the Sleeths, Matthew Sleeth and his spouse and children, all of whom have written a number of books and have a organization called Blessed Earth. So there are very important environmental initiatives in every faith tradition, and when it really is it calls all of us to depoliticize this issue and to think about, well, what does that, if we just think about it as a moral issue, as like a way that something we're doing hurts people, hurts people now, hurts people in the future, hurts the natural world, what would living out our tradition I think I want there's sometimes a tendency to cede. I think both an American tendency and a tendency inside our own community to kind of cede the real religious leaders are the right-wing ones, and the real religious leaders are the Christian ones. And I do want to just say, if you feel that it is a violation of everything you've been taught as sacred to continue to destroy our climate, that is a totally valid religious impulse that you should feel totally fine owning. Anyone who works with us from any tradition, the Unitarian Universalists are like, the Jews, we are all totally valid religious leaders raising religious objections to what is happening to our world. And so I don't want anyone to cede the ground of authenticity to only the most. I believe that we are expressing the totally down the middle of the road teachings of our tradition when we say we shouldn't be destroying our world.
Thank you. And I think that's an important message to think about when we talk about this sort of feeling of authenticity. And I think one of the great things that JCRC is able to do is to bring a variety of Jewish voices to a table, really a plurality of the Jewish community, to look at how is this conversation happening, at our Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, Orthodox, and so on communities, and that the work that we may look through and try and push forward is not just about how is it going to impact one group of Jews, or like, okay, well, that congregation is doing a great job on their green initiative. Great, there are checkbox for Jewish green stuff. Well, not every congregation is going to be able to put solar panels, or not every congregation is going to be able to, have a compost station outside. but what I'm taking away from this is that there is something that every congregation can find a space within this challenge. And it may be something like looking at how are they working within, even within their own neighborhoods in areas of justice, in areas of outreach. I know something that's come up a lot in the Jewish community is issues of food and food insecurity. Maybe how is that tied in? Rabbi Daniel, you started to talk a little bit about the some of the issues that the people of Tuscany were bringing up. How is that impacting the different food situations that we're seeing here locally?
I can speak just in general, and then and if Joelle hops back on, I'm sure she can add to that. But it's very clear that climate fluctuations have always affected agricultural prices, and that we're seeing more and more of that as climate change strikes us worse. And it's important to understand that huge winter storms can be part of climate change, not just the heat waves. And so when you have freak winter storms in Florida, that's as likely to be part of these perturbations of the climate systems as other things. So we're already seeing food prices rising for any number of reasons. And like you said, there are communities that are much more sensitive to that. Joelle, I don't know if there's been anything specific about food prices or security in the DC area.
I will just say that, even though we are disconnected often from the source of our food and industrial system, like we say brachot, right, to remind ourselves, like, this bread came forth from the earth, right? Like this apple came from a tree, and we are when we burn fossil fuels and pour this heat and climate pollution, shifting the climate in which the food that has been grown, is able to we're really disrupting, agriculture, both where we are and around the world, where a lot of subsistence farmers count on being able to bring forth the food they need for their families every year. You can imagine being a farmer in Malawi or Uganda and planting the seeds at the time your grandmother said was the right time, and suddenly it's not working anymore, right? Because something has changed about the climate, not because of anything you or anyone near you has done, but because of the industrialization of the United States and other countries. So, I think food can be a powerful way into this for all of us. The other thing I see Jewish communities doing is shifting away from meat, or from at least the most climate intensive beef. And groups like Avodah, the Jewish Service Corps, made a organization-wide commitment to something called default veg. Default veg doesn't take away anyone's options. It just says, we will serve a vegetarian meal. If you would like the meat meal, check here. So it just changes which is the default and which is the special request, just as setting a community norm that we're going to move away from the most climate-intensive foods. So there are lots of ways to take our Jewish groundedness in the sourcing of our food and use it towards thinking about these issues.
Yeah, there was an article in the New York Times either yesterday or today about different ways that the current agricultural system contributes to climate change and what are some alternatives. And it's worth taking a look at.
Welcome your questions. Please feel free to bring them.
Normally, our participants aren't too shy about this.
So I have a question related in a tangential way to the climate issues. I I know that there are questions about, who are the different climate organizations out there? And we have when we think about who are the Jewish organizations out there in general, we think, JCRCs, ADL, AJC, these larger organizations, and sort of like an old guard, legacy organizations, if you will, and that the climate and environmental world also has these legacy organizations, Sierra Fund, World Wildlife, things like that. There are also newer organizations like Dayenu that you pointed out, and other more grassroots organizations. Maybe could you share a little bit about how that's working, and what are some of the how are people mobilizing in different ways to address climate? What's some of that both generational, historical shift?
Maybe Rabbi Swartz, you could start with discussing COJL itself.
Sure. COJL has been around for over 25 years, was started originally by the National Religious Partnership for the Environment as a cooperative project of the Religious Action Center, JTS, and what was then NJCRAC, and now is JCPA. And we're still officially a project of JCPA, although JCPA itself nationally has environment on its list, but not so close to the top. There are organizations that have in the Jewish community that have been doing at least some environmental work for a long time. Arthur Waskow at the Rabbi Arthur Waskow at the Shalom Center, Hazon, which has done a lot of focus on food. And Dayenu is the new kid on the block, but is also really focused on climate and really has done a fabulous job looking at different ways to open up the Jewish community to climate. You should be aware that Pearlstone, which used to be its own separate organization, Pearlstone Retreat Center in Maryland, is now the headquarters of Hazon, which was headquartered in New York. And Yakir, who was running Pearlstone, is now the head of all of Hazon. And he's and I think in general, we're doing at least a slightly better job of trying to figure out how to be complementary and not competitive with each other. Hazon has focused much more on environmental education, and specifically when it talks about policy about food. Dayenu has, like I said, been laser focused on climate. COJL has always had a broader policy agenda. We used to do other programmatic things more, but given how well those are covered by other organizations, we really have focused, since I've been the head, on policy, and with an emphasis on obviously climate is inescapable, but also looking at other aspects of environmental justice, looking at land conservation, looking at endangered species, and water and air quality. There's thanks, Joelle put in the chat about Jewish Earth Alliance, which is also run in the DC area, and is a group of volunteers who really work together to write letters and to bring issues to their representatives and collect letters from other parts of the country to bring that attention to people. And none of these are giant organizations. So these are all groups that run on fairly tight budgets, and so it's great for us to cooperate given our limited staff, and it's also great for, these are all organizations where a small donation can make a big difference. Joelle can tell you more about the IPL world, but it's a movement that's been around for a while that has state level or regional level chapters in most of but not all of the country right now. And those really do work with the Jewish community and other faith communities wherever they are, addressing both national and local policy issues. And it's a really important group to work with because of its inherently interfaith nature.
I was going to say, yeah, I totally believe in the that we're building a movement, and to build a movement requires everybody and many different tactics. It's like an ecosystem. It's actually better when everyone's playing different roles and we're all, mutually reinforcing each other. Just for an example of how I see really exciting alignment in the Jewish climate space these days is that, Dayenu's organizing model is to support what they call Dayenu circles in specific communities where people work together to do Dayenu campaigns and other climate work. And if you look on their map for the Dayenu circles in this region, you will connect with a group that Interfaith Power and Light DMV convenes called Jewish Climate Action Network DMV, which is like the DC metro area Dayenu circle. And there's Northern Virginia, has Northern Virginia. So like I'm seeing beautiful alignment in the newer national and the grassroots building we've been doing for many, many years, sort of coming together in a way that's making us all much more powerful. I will say in the climate space, there's a role for people who are gonna work from the inside, right? There are people who are gonna help make sure that the JCRC has a really strong climate resolution and make sure that, that was gonna work inside companies and inside as legislators themselves to like try to move things forward. Or people that work inside agencies. There's lots of there's an inside game and there's also an outside game. There are people who are going to protest and hold up signs. And I saw some old friends on this call who helped, who got arrested with me protesting pipelines, and there's a role for all of it, right? There are some of these bigger groups that have a lot of grassroots chapters, and there's also these brand new groups, some of them like youth-led that are very decentralized and are doing their own thing. So, whenever Bill McKibben is a very well-known climate writer and activist, and people say, what's the one thing I can do? What's the one thing I can do to take action on climate change? As one person, what can I do? And he says, don't be just one person. Join a group, and that would be my advice to you all also. This is a journey. It's not a destination, and we need to build a movement, and that movement has many places for everyone. It has a place for everybody's gifts. It has a place for everybody's faith, to be authentic to who you are for everyone, but find a group. I mean, we're happy to play that role, Interfaith Power and Light DMV, but find a group that will call you to action over and over again, that will not, that you'll be on the journey with us. And it's less important which one, because ultimately we're building a movement big enough to change the world.
And one specific opportunity to think about is that, and especially related to the broader work of the JCRC, is that we have this interesting conjunction of faith holidays this spring, when for the first time in a while, Ramadan will overlap Easter and Passover. And also because of where in April Easter and Passover are, we're right around some major Baha'i, Hindu, Jain, Sikh, and Buddhist festivals. And so Reverend Fletcher Harper and Green Faith and Rabbi Arthur Wasco at the Shalom Center, Kojal, Dayenu are all exploring ways that different faith communities could come together around this junction. And Fletcher and Green Faith are focused on finance, on banks that are financing climate change and on divestment. Other people are focusing in other areas, but there is an opportunity, I think, for different faith groups to come together this April with a focus on life and climate and love.
Abby, I did have another question I wanted to ask, and it's a topic, Rabbi Swartz, that you introduced when you were talking about your group's meeting at the Vatican, and that's on the issue of the disparate impact that climate change has on poorer communities and communities of color in particular. So the Biden administration has announced there's an executive order on energy or on environmental justice, and even the Department of Energy has a whole section devoted to energy justice issues, and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is sorry to be so nerdy about this, but they have an Office of Public Participation that for the first time in 45 years has been funded to allow smaller groups to participate in their proceedings, including pipeline certificate proceedings. So what kind of communications are the religious groups having with the administration or with states, that have environmental justice initiatives? I noticed there was a story in the New York, was in the Post of the New York Times today about how underfunded the Council on Environmental Quality is on pushing the executive order, while there's 100 people staffed in California dealing with environmental justice issues.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of work to be done. There is some legislation that is also that Kojal has been working on, and others here, called the Environmental Justice for All Act, that Chairman Grahava of the Natural Resources Committee is doing. I don't know that it has a chance, but it's a great lens for at least looking at what are the kinds of things that need to be that need to be done. One caveat here is that at the beginning of our discussion at the Vatican about environmental justice, there was this kind of older idea of, we're here to speak on behalf of poor and disenfranchised and communities. And very quickly, some people disabused those who were phrasing it that way and said, excuse me, how about instead you open the door and invite in and seat at the table those communities and have them speak for themselves? It's great that you want to hear their voice, but how about actually hearing their voice? And so when you're doing environmental justice work, to do that in partnership with the communities that are affected. And there are local environmental justice organizations in the greater Washington area, any number of them that I think Joelle and others could help direct you to. But there are, these are natural campaigns for a JCRC to get involved in, because it is both promoting justice and it is improving community relations by working with these groups. So I really see that as an avenue of engagement.
The Pope's encyclical says, there's not just a social crisis on the one hand and an ecological crisis on the other, but there's only one crisis. And I think that's the most important thing that I would want everyone to take away from this, is like, it's only one thing. It's the same kind of thinking, the short-term thinking, the assumption of inequality, the assumption that certain people and places are disposable, that that made the climate crisis, the runaway capitalism that makes the climate crisis possible, is the same human error that makes racism and other kinds of human oppression possible. So I invite everyone to really see this as a single, it's a single challenge with a single solution, that we need to, the other thing that's in the encyclical that I love working with people of all faiths to talk about is, he quotes Pope Benedict as saying the external deserts are expanding because the internal deserts have become so vast. So he diagnoses the climate crisis and its impacts inside the human heart and says there are spiritual errors we have made that are making this kind of damage in our world possible. And I have had such amazing conversations asking people in all kinds of communities, including synagogues, where do you see the spiritual error that makes climate crisis possible in your own community and in your own, in your own life, and that, starting there and understanding these are that ultimately, when we say climate justice, we're not putting two different things together. We're really talking about the same mandate, the same problem, and the same solution.
I can't think of a better way to move us to action and to close out this discussion, but to think about, if it starting with ourselves and looking within ourselves, within our communities, as to, where is that spiritual desert? And I think after I don't even know how many months of living in this pandemic, we're all feeling some kind of spiritual desert in some way. And we're knowing that it is all interconnected, and we are all interconnected in how we respond to this. So I'm thinking about what are the types of things that I can do. It's a conversation that my family has had since we were making decisions about which diapers to put on our children, and realizing that we chose one, so we also chose to do something else to offset that. And those are the kinds of conversations that we've been having, my family, for the last over 11 years. And it's things like that I think that we can start to talk about. What are those small steps that lead to the bigger steps? And I am so grateful for this conversation today to help us start to break down this immense challenge and to think about it at this deeply spiritual and personal level and the ripples that it can have out.
And please continue to use this as resources. Both Joelle and I, and I'm sure Dahlia and other Dayenu staff would love to help the JCRC as it moves forward in this work.
So thank you so much, Rabbi Daniel, Joelle, Harvey. Would you like to close us out?
Oh, sure. Very briefly, again, thanks to both of our speakers and for everybody participating today. Just be on the lookout for future brown bag programs. We'll be announcing those. You can find them on the calendar on the JCRC website, and by the other sponsors will send out notices of those. So again, we thank everybody for attending today, giving you lots of food for thought and lots of possible ways to act. Visit the websites that were cited in the chat box and the JCRC's own website. And we know there are things people can do, as Abby said, and as Joelle and Rabbi Dan said as well. So thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you soon.